Kia ora. I'm Kirsten Taylor and I'm the guidance counsellor here at Otago Girls High School. So I was the very fortunate recipient of the Australasian Alliance Fellowship Award last year, which has allowed me to do a project with 12 very courageous rangatahi wahine, so young women. So welcome to my space. This is my counselling office. And just to start the process, because of the nature of the project, I would like to start in a culturally appropriate way, please. So I will do what's called a karakia. So it's an opening passage to create a sense of safety. Tākiri aki te rā, ki runga me wahapu me ngā puki, me huri o tātou whakaaro ki ngā mahi o te rā nei. Whakapiki e te ngākau nui no tangata nei, whakakahaina o tātou tinana, o tātou hiningaro me o tātou wairua. Hei waihanga e manawa e pera me te aroha, kōhau tina, kōhau taike, hui e taiki e. So what I've just said then is, as the sun comes up over the harbour and the hills here in Dunedin, Otago, New Zealand, can we bring our hearts and minds to the aspirations of the work that's been done here? And may we do it with good intention, with spirit and with love. So, and that is what I've been doing for the last 12 months. So the inspiration for the project, so what it is it's called the Whaiora Project, and Whaiora is a Māori name, and it means to seek well-being. And the whole premise of this project is that it front foots from a positivist perspective. So it's very much about resilience and reliance on the resources and resourcefulness of the young women involved. And it was involving 12 young women who had identified themselves early on to me in my counselling practice last year as being high needs. So they all received initial counselling, and it became very clear that there were a large number of adverse childhood experiences that had meant that many of them were experiencing either self-harm or suicidal ideation, or most certainly trauma. I devised the project as a way of answering their needs. So it kind of naturally evolved out of a need. And as I continued to counsel, it became very obvious and clear to me that many of our adolescent young people are really, really struggling with suicidality. And more so now than ever. New Zealand is also in the unfortunate position of not improving our statistics in that area, particularly for youth. So youth being those in the age bracket from 13 through to 24. So that's the rangatahi bracket. So rangatahi means older youth. So for that particular bracket, we haven't improved our outcomes for these young people. Another quite astounding statistic, if you like, is that our Māori and Pacifica students, and whether they're in New Zealand or in Australia, are not flourishing as well as their other counterparts. So others, they're 2 times or twice as likely to experience mental distress or psychological distress and suicide. So while it wasn't a prerequisite of this project that the young women were necessarily Māori or Pacifica, what naturally happened was those that came for help, 8 of them were Māori, 2 were from Samoa, and the others were New Zealand European. And I came up with a concept of a bicultural, or working together. New Zealand is very much about biculturalism, so working with 2 cultures sitting side by side, really, as a result of our commitment to he tangata te reti, or Waitangi. So the Treaty of Waitangi underpins my counselling practice. And I wanted to create something that would utilise the strengths and resources of Te Ao Māori, a Māori worldview, and also the strengths too of a Western modality, of a talking modality. So as such, this project clearly aligns with both cultures. So on the one hand, it has a psycho-counselling model. So I involved myself with 7 discrete counselling sessions with each of the students. So that was 84 separate sessions that we did in the course of that project. And the other part was to invite very strong and highly reputable cultural partners, manawa ora, led by wahine toa, a woman of strength called Jolie Davis. So Jolie works with a method that's the wider umbrella term. It's called rongo Māori. So it's like a natural form of Māori healing. And her particular method is mirimiri and raumiri. So mirimiri is works on acupressure, essentially. And the word mirimiri means to agitate and to stimulate. So it's a very physical process, but it's also wrapped up in an incredibly, in tika, so what is right, so tikanga, so wrapped up in cultural processes. So as well as these young women being in one-to-one sessions with me, we also had 4 people who came down from the North Island, and we all went and stayed at Puketeraki Marae out at Karatane, which is a location about 40 minutes away from school and where they live, so that we were deliberately away on a marae, on a culturally appropriate space. The girls were welcomed onto that space appropriately. There was a cultural safety wrapped around them for the entire time as they both received mirimiri treatments and learned how to regulate their own bodies and minds, and learned how to nourish their own spirits, I guess, from a Te Ao Māori perspective. So a very, very critical part of this process was a spiritual part. And it was non-denominational, so it didn't matter if these young women were had Christian underpinnings or believed in the God system of Te Ao Māori or Buddhist, in fact. You know, it didn't actually matter as long as that spiritual dimension where they're tapping into their own intuition and their own depth and resources was a part of the process. So across that time, we stayed for 48 hours in total, and the group really started to bond and meld as a group. The third part or strand to the project was then for these young women, once they'd learned these tools and techniques, was to go home to their own whānau, their own families, and bring that healing back into their own home. And because one of the things that I observed was that many of the young women, once they started to feel better, their healing process went really, really quickly. So as an indication, there were a number of different measures that we took. But anyway, I'll park that and talk about that in one moment. But firstly, the third strand was for them to go back to their families, and those families were then invited in with the young people and the practitioners to participate in a hui or a meeting for the day down at what's called our classroom by the sea. So deliberately, I chose locations that were away from this particular site, so that the environmental conditioning of being in a school wasn't part and prevalent, because it is a healing time as opposed to an academic time. So I wanted to demarcate that space. So we went and I put on a whole lot of kai, a whole lot of food. The process around it was the same. So there was spiritual kind of clearing and karakia, some waiata and singing, as well as the practice of learning these different techniques on the body. So acupressure, applying pressure to varying parts of the body to release trauma, essentially, and to reground the body. Not all families turned up. So that's of note. Not all families turned up, but 2/3 of the families turned up. And so too did some of the pastoral care team from Otago Girls High. And that in itself was a brilliant part of the project because it strengthened the relationships between the girls and the staff, and which was critical. The measures for success. The project was actually unbelievably successful in a sense, in that all 12 young women are alive and are in varying stages of healing, health and well-being. 9 of the women or young women went from a stage of being at risk, according to a tool that I use to measure this, at risk to being into a growth zone, being into a stage of thriving. The other remaining 3 were very, very close to being in that position. The other measure or tool that was an indicator of, I guess, success was one called, it was in keeping with the bicultural theme, I also used a Māori tool to measure success, because success for Māori has to be measured in a Māori way, in a kaupapa Māori way, a way that is fit for purpose. And that tool is designed by Taina Piripi and Vivian Body, and it's called the Tihei Wā Moriora tool. So this is the tool here. And when the young girls or women were at the beginning of this, they were in a state of te pō. So this is based on creation myth and light. And they were in a state of te pō, so in the darkness of the night, so not able to see out. By the end of the project, they were up here, majority of them, nearly all of them, up here in what's called te ao marama, the bright light of day, thriving. And that transition happened really naturally and readily as a result of this, I believe, integrating an Indigenous model into the therapeutic practice. And this is the first time in a secondary school setting that rongo Māori, mirimiri particularly, has been used in conjunction and used in a research method in conjunction with Pākehā models. The 3 key findings that came out of the project were firstly that using moving away from the question of how do we prevent suicide, which is a deficit way of thinking, into working with how do we increase protective factors for our young people? How do we give them the tools that they require? It was a really, really empowering tool to have given them, both for the work that they did and received themselves, the work that they're able to now do on themselves, and the work that they're now able to do with their families. So that connection has enhanced the protective factors for these young people. So the connection to me as the counsellor, the connection to each other as Whaiora group, and the connection to their families and to the pastoral care team have all been critical in enhancing the protective nature of where they're at. So it's not that they don't struggle sometimes, these young people, but when they come back quickly and they get on board with me quickly again. So it's given them that ability to know there's always a safety net there for them and to know what that safety net is. It's very telling that the students who did not thrive so well are those who didn't have whānau or family engagement and help, and those that didn't participate in the whānau day or the classroom by the sea. Those young people without those support structures from family were less likely to thrive. It also was quite telling that the young women who really thrived were those in the senior schools. So I had 4 juniors and the remainder were senior students. So when I say seniors, I mean 15 and 16-year-olds. The 15 and 16-year-olds had the cognitive ability or the thinking ability to really be able to utilize the knowledge and the learning and still their busy minds and get into their bodies, and allow themselves to be in a state of sensory regulation, which is what that technique, that particular tool, the miri tool, afforded them. It gave these young people, the second key finding was that it allowed these young people to have a sense of self-awareness. So they could see, oh, I'm usually in my head too much. I'm always overthinking things. Oh, being on my phone 24/7 is the thing that's driving me crazy. Or, you know, like it allowed them to become aware of what was happening in their bodies, what was happening in their minds, and what they weren't doing to help themselves. Like they became aware that I'm not getting enough sleep, or I'm not eating very well actually, and that's really, really hurting me. Or these relationships I'm in aren't serving me particularly well, and I'm not respected within these. So they made some really big decisions for themselves as a result of this process. The most important and imperative part of the project, I think, was that using a culturally appropriate tool allowed these young people, regardless of ethnicity, to become agentic, to become empowered to run their own lives and to have hope. Many of them have gone on and helped others learn the tools themselves. 3 of the young women, junior students, actually taught techniques to the entire Year 9 cohort. And they were quite shy, these kids, and they really, really did well with that. The senior students have gone on, and many of them are now in tertiary education or tertiary providers or doing careers and things that they really, really want to do that is fulfilling for themselves. It's allowing them to have a sense of purpose. So they're agentic. So the 3 key findings really were connection to self, to others, to whānau, to pastoral care teams, self-awareness and an understanding of how to, and in Māori terms, that's called whakamarama, to understand, and then whakamana, to have power, empowerment, to have agency. So it's been highly successful, and moving forward, I would like to thank the Alliance very much for the opportunity to trial this. There's no way that without that assistance, nor with the assistance of my principal, Linda Miller, and the Wellbeing Pastoral Care Assistant Principal, Sue Porter, and the brilliant Manawa Order team, and Jolie Davis, there's no way that this project would have come to fruition. And I'm eternally grateful for their support and help. And I would love to trial this. I mean, this has been a pilot, and I would love to integrate this into counselling practice, at very least within Aotearoa, and to look at ways that it might be adapted in an Australasian setting, because it's, I think, taonga tuku iho, treasures of the past, to look back and to find the things that were already known, to rediscover those things and to utilise those things at a time where our young people are quite spiritually bereft, I think is really key and really important. And I thank you for this opportunity.
Hi, Kirsten. It's fantastic to be speaking with you today. I absolutely loved reading through the write-up of your research project. And I'm just wondering, you know, going right back to the beginning, how you came up with this idea for involving Indigenous Maori culture and traditions and philosophy in looking at a group of girls at your school who were really struggling.
I came up with the idea because I'd been in the fortuitous position of having participated in an Indigenous Māori healing wānanga, they call it. So that's an educational kind of weekend, using this particular method that ended up being used in the research. And while I was at the workshop, there were a whole group of students. They were older students, not secondary school, but tertiary students, and they were working together as a group in the context of that learning. And I realised while I was watching them that it was hugely beneficial for young people to be able to connect in spiritually, to have some really clear tools that they could use, and also to be working together. Like, I watched these people really enjoying themselves and learning through their enjoyment, as well as feeling spiritually safe and held in that educational space, in that space on the marae where we were when I was learning. And I started feeling that there was probably a great opportunity for an alliance between myself and the cultural partners who were actually providing the workshops that I was learning from.
So was it the case that with, these girls at your school who've, experienced some quite adverse circumstances in their families, after doing the weekend yourself, were you starting to see that this connection with their Maori or other culture could be of real benefit to them, where perhaps a traditional Western approach might not have worked?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also saw from my own perspective, because I'm not Māori in whakapapa myself, but I have a really strong affinity. But I could see through my own kind of Celtic origins that having tools that were addressing your kind of healing, health and well-being spiritually was a huge, rich resource and a huge advantage. And these young people really needed something to hang on to. And the predominantly the women in the study, or the young girls in the study, they are mostly Māori and Pacifica, but also from New Zealand European backgrounds. And a traditional method can apply to anyone. It doesn't have to just apply to Māori. And that became obvious, yeah.
I got the impression reading your paper that I feel like this is something that maybe New Zealand is, well, I would actually say leading the world in, not just ahead of Australia, but I feel that that New Zealand has very much embraced Maori culture and traditions, and that has really come through your paper. It's something that is not perhaps as well advanced in Australia, but I still feel that, as for me, someone who had no knowledge of that you explained the terms so well, and I was really taken on that journey. But I wonder, was it something that you do have, even though you're not Maori yourself, do you have a background in, or did you find yourself learning a lot of new things as well?
I do have a background in it as well. Previous to being a counsellor, I was a head of a department of art, and my master's thesis in art was looking at contemporary Māori art practices and how they interfaced in the Western world. So I've always been really, really interested at looking at that kind of then between Western thinking and Indigenous thinking, and what both of those bodies of knowledge have got to offer, really, regardless of the context. And I think I feel particularly privileged, actually, being in New Zealand, that Māori have been so generous with their sharing of their own traditional knowledge. And I think that I personally feel as a European that it's my responsibility to be able to, I guess, showcase that with as much respect as possible.
Totally. And so how did the conversation start then at your school, where you were wanting to take this to the next step and actually try and help these girls who were, had become disengaged from perhaps the traditional counselling processes that you were operating?
Yeah, I had a conversation with two really key people actually at school, one of whom was Linda Miller, the principal of Otago Girls High, and the other is Sue Porter, the wellbeing assistant principal. And they were incredibly supportive and brave, actually, as well, because they were so behind this from the get-go. if I hadn't had that traction, I think, really early on, I wouldn't have been able to carry on with even the idea in its kind of fledgling state. So Linda was really immediately on board and looking for a way that we could do this. And it was her suggestion that we applied to the Alliance. And so too was Sue. And Sue participated in the entire project from start to finish and has been incredibly supportive throughout. So I was really lucky. They could immediately see what I saw, and I'd only just started the job. Like, I only started last year as a counsellor. So it's my first year as a counsellor last year when I created the project, and they were really behind it. They didn't question me or my knowledge base or my skill. They were really, really, truly encouraging. And for that, I'm very thankful.
Well, maybe it's because, hearing you explain it, I mean, how could you not, support it? It's such an incredible idea. And I was just wondering about, obviously you got the school on board, and then you had these cultural partners with the Maori traditional healers, and they ran a 3-day workshop, which not only involved the girls going to a marae and learning. Perhaps you could explain the mirimiri and other training that they did, but I'm also interested in the involvement of the parents and how important that was as well.
Oh, absolutely. It was critical to the success of the project to have the parents on board. And the way we did that was to invite them in to the school to meet with myself and to have full explanation of what the project was going to entail. And then also once the girls had learned the process and practice of mirimiri, to then be part of a workshop where all members of the family were invited in for a day, and we shared our knowledge with them and went through the process of actually doing mirimiri with them, so they could see what had been learned. And a lot of those skills were then taken back into the home. It became really obvious how critical the connection between both myself and my cultural partners, the school and the whānau or family members were, when there were students who didn't have family who were participating. Those girls have struggled to retain the information and knowledge that they learned, and also to feel connected and safe.
So this was something new for me, learning about what mirimiri was, and it's a hands-on, almost like it's not acupuncture, but like a pressure. Is it massage, or is it different to massage?
Jolie Davis, the person whom I work very closely with from Manawa Order, would say mirimiri is not massage. Like, she's really, really staunch about that. And I can understand that. It's a process that is very much, if you think of something more along an Eastern acupressure line, you're totally on the right track. And actually I've got the rako, or the tool, one of the tools here that you use, and it's just about applying pressure to different acupoints, or acupressure haimata they're called, points in the body, along the body, to release built up tensions and pressures and to get all the energy flowing in the right direction. I think the reason that Jolie says it's not massage is because along with that it's wrapped up in cultural safety. So you're doing karakia or blessings and prayer as you're doing it. It's very much using song and waiata to change the energy vibrations as well along the way. It's bringing awareness and understanding to your body and what's happening inside your body, and taking yourself out. What I noticed with the young people was it really took them out of their brain and into their body, and really grounded them, and gave them some ability to regulate themselves in a sensory way.
And I imagine the conversations and the interactions that they were having with their family as well. For those perhaps who had, even though they were Maori themselves, but were not really aware of, this side of Maori culture, it would have been for them sort of deeply personal, learning something, connecting, then sharing that with their parents. but also it's that give and take between parents and their daughters in terms of dealing with stress and tension and finding that lovely connection between themselves.
Absolutely. One of the really core sort of reflections that Jolie and I did after our workshop was how many of the young women who were on the workshop, how much they are carrying of their family pressures, stresses, traumas, like how much it sits in their bodies and how much of it isn't really theirs. So once we started working with them, and once they'd released some of that pressure and tension, they were free to be themselves. And you could see, and they got on board really, really quickly. Like it was almost like a really quick awakening for them. And the beautiful thing about adolescents is they heal really fast. When they get on board, they go quickly. They're fantastic. So it's that mutual sort of, they were healed and then their family gets healed. And there were some amazing first times that occurred. So there was one young girl or young woman, I will call her, she really not terribly closely connected to her Māori heritage because her mum had previously been away from the home. But during the course of this project, mum came back and for the first time in years participated with dad, mum, the children in some of this healing and in some of the skills and tools. And she felt really kind of a bit frightened by it, but also really, really happy to have mum back alongside her. And it was really vital.
So the girls who took part in this project, they have had, as I said, some incredibly adverse circumstances in their lives. And it's obvious from reading your paper that the majority of them had a fantastic outcome, but that is not to minimise, what has the circumstances of their lives. So I'm just wondering, you can never get over what has already happened to them, but how do you think that the program that they participated in helps them deal with that and then move to a better place?
I think it... that's the dog, by the way. Sorry. I think that what they were able to do was to look at it and to access the help they needed. So they were able to, instead of turning the other way and pretending it wasn't something that was part of them, they were able to look at it and then integrate it into their awareness of themselves. And it became just a part of themselves, not the thing that completely defined who they were. So if you're sitting in that trauma, all you're seeing is the trauma, and so every reaction and interaction is around that. But if you're able to process that and put it to rest slightly, then you get to express yourself and your own authenticity in a much bigger, broader way. So it just becomes integrated into the being, as opposed to about in the way of the being, kind of. So it's really, it allows a freedom for them to reflect on who they are and what's happened to them, but also to acknowledge that they've got real strength and that they can actually, as a result of that strength, have their own life.
So just to be clear, some of these girls have been in situations where they don't have one of their parents at home, living at home. They have been the victim of physical abuse, even sexual abuse. They have witnessed domestic violence. Some of them, or maybe even most of them, have had suicidal thoughts or maybe even attempted suicide. So we're not talking about minor issues here. We are talking about girls with, very adverse backgrounds. But clearly it seems that the connection at a spiritual level and the idea that this was a very holistic program that is looking at their inner strength and giving them a completely different way of perhaps addressing some of the issues in their life that has, and I love this, the fact that so many of the girls, you know, like using the terms that I guess come from the Maori language, was that they had felt that they had moved from the dark into the light.
Yeah, I mean, there was part of my project was to see how the girls were doing by looking at a tool that was called Tiheiwa Modiora. So it's part of that creation myth. So from the dark night, the girls could posit themselves along the spectrum to the bright light of day, Tiong Marama, where there is life, where there's flourishing. And at the beginning of the project, many of them identified as being in a state of te po, or the long night, the deep night. But that's not in a Western way. It's not depression, but it's only a glimmer of light. Like I'm not feeling like their modi or their life force is glowing really strongly. Through the course of the project, by connecting to one another, connecting to Jolie, their spirituality, myself, their whānau, their family, and also to be able to retain those connections when they need it, has been critical in getting them to move along that scale and to be flourishing, to be feeling like they're thriving. And they certainly bounce back and forth, you know, that it's not linear. Some of these students subsequent to the project have continued to experience huge trauma. One of the students had recently, her father committed suicide himself, and real shockingly sad, difficult things to have to hold. But because we'd already established connection, and we had a connected group, the Whaiora group, we have been able to hold her in that grief and also work with her immediately, and she's immediately sought help. So those connections are ongoing and sustaining.
That's really wonderful to hear. And what about the other girls? I know that some of them have moved on to tertiary study or made other positive steps.
They're great, and they keep coming back and telling me how awesome they are and how well they're doing, which is brilliant. So we've got, I think, and they're doing things that they love and want to do themselves, that are really authentically them. So one of our young people, she's doing an apprenticeship in on a dairy farm, loving it. Another one wasn't managing to attain sort of levels 2 and 3 in a school environment, too triggering because of the degree of her trauma. So she's now doing it in a much more low-key way in a polytech course, and is thriving. There's another who is doing fabulously well, left actually at the end of our year 12, so we usually stay till year 13. She left a year early and has gone and is now doing a performance degree at university. So they're all really, another one who had disconnected from school pretty much completely is now back and attending regularly and is completing her level 2 certificate. So they're all at varying stages of sorting themselves out, both academically and personally.
So it sounds to me like, you know, this is something that Otago Girls High School will continue with in some form if it's, you know, been so successful. What sort of plans do you have?
Well, as I was so fortunate to receive the funding from the Alliance, it's clear that you need money to be able to do these things. So my plan is actually to apply for some community funding. I would really, really love to do this on a, you know, repeat this again, but broaden it, so that I had more junior students who are being mentored by senior students. The local marae would probably be the most logical place, Araituru it's called, it's our urban marae, to, so instead of a cultural partnership from up north, I would use local or utilise local resources and people to be able to work alongside, which would be more meaningful in terms of local iwi and hapu, which is appropriate for the way Māori work in this country. So yeah, I would make it quite local, I think, and try and get it so that my senior students were starting to teach and bring along the junior students. There's
so much to come out of this program. and we could talk forever, I'm sure, but one of the things that I know that you mentioned at the end of your paper and that struck a chord with me was the incredible importance of the Indigenous healing side, which we've talked about at the beginning of our chat. But clearly it would have wider implications. So I'm just wondering what you think about perhaps teachers in other countries that are perhaps have experience of other cultures or interest in other cultural healing practices, that they might be able to read your paper and then it might spark an idea in them, perhaps not to use Maori culture, especially if they're not in New Zealand, but to look at other cultural practices.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that we have this beautiful, rich Indigenous learning and knowledge, and it doesn't matter whether you're in Australia, in parts of Asia. It really, those deep spiritual practices are something that I believe that we're craving in a Western context. I think there's a need for a response that has historically had thousands of years worth of use and value. And yeah, I think to look to, I've sort of am writing another piece at the moment, and it's called Taonga Tuku Iho, which means treasures of the past. And I think whatever our cultural context, to be able to look at the treasures of our past respectfully and to integrate those in a way that's going to really heal up our current societal kind of traumas is a really, really worthwhile process and practice.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you applied for the Alliance Fellowship. Obviously you did need funds, and $10,000 is certainly a fantastic contribution towards that. But it's more than that, because I feel like you yourself, as well as Otago Girls High School and the students, have really had a valuable experience. So thank you so much for undertaking that research, and we wish you all the best going forward, and hope that it will lead you on to more research in this area. I feel like it's quite amazing to me that you've only been a counsellor for a year. And you've just well, maybe sometimes you need to sort of come from outside and bring in a different perspective, and also for sharing for those of us who are not from New Zealand, that the Maori knowledge and culture. I think there's just so much to be learned, and well done to your school as well for supporting you through this.
Absolutely, they've been amazing.
Yes, I'm sure perhaps you might have a few thank yous at the end here.
I have, definitely. I definitely want to thank the Alliance first and foremost, because they've enabled this project to happen, and I feel like this is it's the little seed that's starting out, and I really hope it will grow and flourish actually as I sort of move through and try and continue this work. Really want a heartfelt thanks to Jolie, who was Jolie Davis, who was the other cultural partner, who could see the vision really quickly and got on board the waka and helped with everything. Linda Miller and Sue Porter, amazing. Really saw it quickly and worked with it, and any funds that were needed that weren't covered by the allowance that I received, they have more than contributed. So the school have put in an equal amount probably in effect. And I guess my husband, he has had to, and my 4 children. So they've had to be on the back burner. They've been incredibly supportive, so I'm very grateful for them.
And not to mention the dog who makes a guest appearance.
I'm really apologetic. I was trying for him to be quiet. I've fed him and done all sorts of things so that he wouldn't make an appearance, but he's also happily sitting here supporting the process and the project.
No, well, I think it's nice because, we're all are so used to Zoom now, but it is nice to have a little bit of humanity injected into Zoom. thank you again so much for sharing with us today. It was such a joy to read your research paper, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you very much.